I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of the holidays. It's cold, Christmas music is playing in an infinite loop, and I'm constantly forced to show fake enthusiasm and sentimentality that my Grinch heart does not have. It's also a tough time for people with certain developmental conditions or people who have a history of trauma, abuse, and neglect. And in this video, we're going to give you some tips on how to survive the holidays. In the description below, we're going to have a link where you can print off the Organ Behavior Consultation Skills-Based Holiday Planning Sheet. And what the sheet will do will walk you through some of the major cognitive skills that can be problems and cause behaviors during holiday seasons. In this video, I'm going to talk about many of those concepts, but it will be very helpful if you print off the form and fill it out for yourself and your client or child. So there's a couple of things that we want to keep in mind before the holiday season gets here. The first is that we want to avoid any mindsets of they're going to pull it together, or things will be okay, or we're going to expect a Christmas miracle. If you don't plan for the holidays and you wait for them to come and you try to deal with it in the moment, you're probably not going to do well. And this is because a lot of the issues that arrive have direct links to cognitive skills that require planning. In several other videos, which we'll link in the description below, we've talked about proactive conversations and proactive plans. We use this method to try to anticipate a behavior and have a conversation with our child or client ahead of time. That way we can prevent the behavior. As the holiday season draws near, you're going to want to start having these proactive conversations with your child or client. And the skills-based holiday planning sheet can guide you in these conversations. We're going to talk about 6 major skills that are a frequent cause of challenging behaviors during the holiday season. And as you're going to see, they're a frequent cause for challenging behaviors all year around too. The first skill is planning. People who have trouble making plans in their heads are constantly forced to adjust to new plans or new situations that they're unfamiliar with, especially during the holiday season. The more unfamiliar activities there are, even if they seem to be fun activities, the more we're requiring the person to make constant plans to adjust and to reduce anxiety. This means that they're going to be using a lot of executive functioning fuel, which we've talked about in another video. The second skill is transitioning from one thing to another. Now, many of our kids struggle with transitioning, which is why we have them on routines, because the more familiar each item is, the easier it generally is to transition. But now, even with the holidays having a lot of fun activities, it's going to be new and novel, and transitioning might be more difficult. So we're going to want to have some things in place to support that. The third skill is handling changes to your routine. A lot of the kids that we work with are in school most of the time, and so they have that routine ready to go. But with the holidays, they're going to have a couple of weeks off, and now they're likely going to either be at home or in an unfamiliar environment, and they're just not going to be used to this routine. There's some things that we can do to make expectations clear and to make the new routine go a little bit smoother. The fourth skill is being able to prevent overstimulation. A lot of our kids have sensory issues, and with the holidays there's a lot of overstimulating activities. So we want to make sure that we take those into consideration. That way we can avoid overstimulation, which can lead to escalation or sensory meltdowns. The fifth thing we're going to talk about is not so much a skill, but rather a factor of a person, and that's trauma. Has this person experienced trauma? If your child has been adopted and they remember old memories around the holidays with their previous family, or if they've been in the foster care system and they've had all these different foster families, or if holidays are just generally a tough time because of all the other skill reasons, when the holidays start coming up, we might see some behaviors that are directly related to that trauma. We're going to want to have things in place to support these people because the holidays are meant to be a time of great happiness, but they might be experiencing a tremendous amount of sadness, and it might be significant enough to immediately impact their behavior. And the sixth thing we're going to consider are social skills, as well as family interactions. Around this time of year, many of our kids will be hanging around with extended family members who maybe don't understand what's going on, especially if they have FASD. It's very common for parents and foster providers to feel judged by these family members and maybe even have some conflicts around their children's behavior. So we're going to want to have some kind of plan in place for these family members so they know how to respond if a behavior starts to happen, which probably will be they should not respond at all and they should leave it to their caregiver. So before we talk about specific skill-based responses based upon those particular difficulties, there are some things that everybody's going to want to do before the holiday season hits. The first thing, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is to schedule out every single day and to make it structured. This doesn't mean that every time has to have something going on. You might structure 3 hours of downtime in which your child or client can kind of do whatever they want around the house. But that block of time should be structured, especially to compare it to the other things going on for that day. You're also going to want to keep this holiday routine as consistent as possible, which I understand is difficult because there's so many random events going on. But especially in the mornings, if we can get a nice morning routine going, we're going to be more likely to set our child or client up for success for the activities that happen later in the day. Remember the concept of executive functioning fuel. You're going to want to remember to visualize this in a way that your child or client understands. So if they read, you might have a different page for each day that you guys can lay out and kind of plan or talk about each day. Or if they can't read, you're going to need to use some pictures and make sure that you talk about it and that they understand it. Some clients do really well when they have the information ahead of time and they can think about these changes, ask questions, and even practice the new routine. For those clients, you might want to start having these proactive conversations right after Thanksgiving, so they have about a month to prepare. Other clients will get anxious if they're told that far in advance. So for them, we might want to wait until it's closer to their holiday routine to talk to them about it. Remember, they're going to need a lot of time to process and to ask questions, and you cannot do this routine verbally. It has to be represented visually, not just for your child or client, but also for you. It will help. It takes a lot of work to plan out these days, but it will be worth it, and you will thank yourself later. I already briefly mentioned downtime, and one thing you want to keep in mind is that too much downtime for a lot of our kids and clients is going to result in some challenging behaviors. We don't want them to be bored, but at the same time we don't want to constantly schedule them and make them feel overwhelmed with expectation. Determining how much downtime there should be will be up to you based upon your knowledge of your child or client. You're going to want to have family, friends, or caregivers come in to relieve you for a little bit each day. You also need to identify the holiday traditions that are most important to you and ask yourself if this is something that your child or client can handle. If there's a risk that they're going to go into a behavior and you're going to try to make it work anyway, and if they are unsuccessful, that would ruin your tradition and, make you emotional, you're going to want to avoid that. Maybe there's somebody else who could be with them during that time, or maybe you can have enhanced supports during that time. But again, what you want to do is plan for those activities. Don't cross your fingers and hope for a Christmas miracle. So let's talk about some ways that we can help based upon those 6 skills and factors that we talked about earlier. The first is planning. We've had a couple of videos on planning, so you can use those suggestions. Also, having the schedule visualized will help people who struggle with planning in their head, especially in the moment. You might want to consider having a visual with what is going on and what will be happening next that's a little bit more portable that you can take from place to place. You can also have your expectations of your kiddo or client written on that visual, that way you can check in with them frequently. You're going to be putting a lot of effort into structuring and scheduling these days, but of course life is going to happen and adjustments will need to be made. When this happens, you need to remember that once the person learns that something has to change, many cognitive skills are expected of them, including adjusting to the new routine. You can help provide cognitive support by telling them exactly what's changing, why it's changing, and what our expectations are of them. And of course, the most important thing you can do after that is give them time to process. If you wait until the last minute, or that's just how the situation plays out, you're going to be more likely to have a behavior because now we're forcing them to transition into something unfamiliar, and that can create some anxiety and escalation. The next skill is transitions. We've already talked about some supports that can help with that, but you're also going to want to remember that during the holidays we tend to have a lot of these unfamiliar and new activities, which even though they're fun, will mean that we're going to have to do more transitions. Transitioning is found in the executive functioning part of the frontal lobe, which means executive functioning fuel plays a role here. The more we can make the person familiar with what the transitions will look like, and maybe even practice with them for certain transitions, the better they will be able to transition in the moment. To help them transition themselves, you're going to want to keep a few things in mind. 1, are you verbally transitioning when a visual transition will do? Remember, people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and other developmental conditions don't always process what we're saying very well. We call this receptive communication, and we have some videos on it. This means that in the moment when we're expecting them to hold it together and transition from one unfamiliar thing to the next, we want to do as little as possible to cause aggravation, and talking is one of those things. So try thinking of ways that you can transition your child or client without using words. You're going to use the proactive conversation model to get them to understand what you'll be doing and maybe even to practice. The third skill is being able to adjust to a change in routine, which ultimately the schedule that we'll be talking about will help with. We're also going to want to probably check in toward the beginning of the day with our child or client to talk about how yesterday went as far as following the routine and if they have any concerns about what today will bring. You're going to want to avoid having this conversation first thing in the morning though, because part of the suggestions that I have is to allow your child every morning of the holidays to wake up with as few expectations as possible. Let them wake up and adjust and look at whatever visuals they have breakfast, and get dressed and kind of follow their own routine without having us kind of get at them right at the very beginning, which can cause either overstimulation or agitation. And if we're working with kids who tend to be oppositional, it's definitely going to start those oppositional behaviors. When your child is struggling with the routine and the changes that it brings, you're going to want to remember that that's exactly what it is. They're not trying to make your life difficult. They're not trying to ruin everybody's good time. They're having issues adjusting to this routine. You're going to want to avoid using ultimatums or punishments such as taking away a future activity or a present that they want. That might get you immediate compliance, but it can create some significant problems later and make us ultimately unsuccessful. The fourth element we're going to talk about is sensory processing. If your child or client struggles with sensory processing on a good day, they're sure as heck going to struggle with it during the holidays. This means that we might have to have more sensory support, and that can take a lot of different forms. First of all, make sure that no matter where you're at, be it the grocery store or some kind of family get-together, that you have some kind of sensory release. This can include some kind of sensory toy or some kind of activity that they can step away and do, or maybe even some kind of handheld device where they can step away and destimulate a little bit. If your expectation is that your child will be able to sit still and listen to a bunch of adults talk at a family get-together, you probably have unrealistic expectations. From a sensory standpoint, this means that we need to be okay giving frequent breaks, even if that means that we ourselves have to step away from the activities. If it's a party or some other kind of intense sensory environment, that might mean a break every 10 or 15 minutes. That's okay. So we're going to want to find out what sensory preferences our kids or clients have. That way we can try to proactively put those into the schedule. This might look like enjoying deep pressure and having it be very calming to them. Well, what you're going to want to do then is put deep pressure, such as a back rub, in the schedule proactively to see if that can help you avoid overstimulation from happening in the first place. What people typically do is wait until they see signs that their kiddo is being overstimulated and then they try to intervene. So instead, try being proactive and putting those interventions in throughout the day. For kids with sensory issues going into a potentially triggering environment, you're going to want to make sure that they understand where they can go if they need a break. Depending on their skills and abilities to be unsupervised, they might be able to step out on their own. Also, if you're going to be somewhere for a long period of time, you're going to want to pull them out maybe once every half hour or 20 minutes or whatever it needs to be for them just to check in, even if things are going well. And remember, you're going to want to tell them that this is what you're doing, because if things are going well and they're having fun and you go and you try to pull them away and they don't understand that it's only for a quick 30 seconds, they might get escalated because they have to put together your motivations in that moment. So make sure you tell them that's what you're going to do. The fifth thing we're going to consider is trauma. And unfortunately, when it comes to trauma, there isn't much that we can do other than be aware of what that trauma was, be there for the person, and try to get a sense of how they're doing. If they're having a bad day, especially due to trauma, we might have to be okay with adjusting expectations. Some people are able to talk about their feelings of trauma and how they're doing and how it's impacting them right now without having it actually trigger them. Other people can't do that without getting really upset. If you have a counselor or a therapist involved with your child or client, you should check in with them about how to best handle this kind of situation. And the last thing we're going to consider are family and social skill issues. A lot of people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and certain other disabilities struggle with social interactions, especially with all of the other skills that we've already talked about, and sensory potentially being an element and trauma being an element. Things can get overwhelming really quick, and this can manifest itself in a lot of ways. They might be irritable around certain people, or they might get really overexcited and kind of ramp up. And you can tell they're having a lot of fun, but they're making other people uncomfortable with their enthusiasm, as it were. And you know that they're wrapping themselves up for a potential difficult issue down the road. So you're going to want to practice and make your expectations very clear with your client or child. You can do this proactively in the month ahead of these interactions, but you're also going to probably want to do it the few hours before any significant interactions. This includes potentially role-playing what you can do if you get upset. This can include coming up with a signal that you can give them if they're becoming a little bit overexcited or they need to follow the plan to take some space to calm down. It can include having a plan for them to go somewhere once an hour to check in with you, and all of the other things that we've discussed. Another element of this is how our families view us. Many of my families have extended families who don't get fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. The parents feel judged on a good day, and then we have Christmas and other holidays happening where all of these family members might be coming around, and so parents and caregivers can feel very, very judged. So if you have a family member who you think might be a problem, maybe they're a little too authoritarian, or they're going to be interfering when you are trying to give your kiddo time to process, or something like that, you're going to want to be proactive with them too. This might just mean sending out an email, letting them know what some of your kids' issues are, or it might be as simple as saying something like, hey, if something goes on, just come and get me, please, because it will be best if I handle it. And again, hopefully you can prevent this by frequently checking in with your kiddo and making sure that they're doing well. If they're struggling, you can take them aside, role play a little bit, or maybe provide some kind of sensory intervention. So again, we have a worksheet that will help kind of walk you through some of these suggestions. You can find it in the link in the description below. When it comes to holidays and family, another thing you're really going to want to keep in mind, and this will be difficult for many of you, is to let certain traditions go. When you have a typical teenager and they're having an attitude issue during some kind of family event, let's say you're trying to get a picture taken and you have kind of a sulky teenager. Many teenagers you can kind of force to just do it, and you might see in the picture that they weren't having a good time, but you as a parent feel good for making them feel involved. It's not going to be a good situation if you push your child or client to participate in certain traditions or activities that they are very clearly telling you that they do not want to do, or that they are not cognitively able to do because it demands skills that they do not have. You might need to learn to be okay with letting them sit off by themselves, destimulating somehow or otherwise regulating themselves while other family activities carry on. You can help prevent this from happening if you structure and schedule things and make sure that your child or client knows what to expect at any given time. You can also address it by having a plan in place of what they can do if they get frustrated. So if we're trying to get something set up for a family picture and you see them getting agitated, maybe instead of standing there waiting while everybody's yelling directions at everybody to pose, they can go somewhere else, and then once they're ready to come in, we can ask them to come in, stand in a certain place, take the pictures, and then they can again go and destimulate or regulate themselves. I hope this video was helpful. Again, we have the Organ Behavior Consultation skills-based holiday planning sheet available for you in the description below. If you haven't already, please like our page on Facebook, and as you see posts that we share, please share them yourself if they're helpful. It helps to get more views onto our videos as well as onto our Facebook page. Thanks for watching.